But I want to prove that there's logic behind this. In 1970, when the baby boomers were growing up and they had all their kids, if you can look at these lines, each one of these, this is under 5 years, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, this is all in your pamphlets. I know it's hard to read, but groups of people and how many there are. These are called population trees. So you can see back in the 70s, we had 7 and 8, up to 8,000 individuals aged 5 to 10 and 10 to 14. What happened is they all grew up. In the 1990s, most of them moved away, or a lot of them did. I found out in the 2000s, a fair amount of them came back, and they started having kids again. Not many, but enough to keep us from continuing to fall. The structure really hasn't changed much at all since then. So we're in this situation where I don't see any big declines, but I also don't see, any reason to believe that there's going to be massive increases either, not based on demographics. Certainly is going to be driven by employment growth if there are. The other way we look at it is we break the total enrollment, same time periods, basically, by breaking it down into groups of K2, 3, 5, 6, 8, 9, 12 students. So I'm looking at cohorts of students. There's only two things you really need to get out of this slide. One is the gap between the high school group and the other ones. The high school group is naturally bigger because it's 4 grades instead of 3. But the gap between it has been expanding. Population's been continuing to age. Get an older and older profile of student. Up until about 2000, 2003. And now what I'm looking at, and what I'm really hanging our hat on for the future, is look at that K2. Those are the little kids. Those are the leading indicators of enrollment. And you can see that that's actually been on an upward trend for 5 or 6 years. So it's not, again, not leaps and bounds, but the structure is changing, and for the time being, it's going to get a little bit younger rather than a little bit older. In addition to looking at student information that way, we use what's called the geographic information system. And so I'm looking at the location on this map of the district. These dark lines are my 317 areas I told you that I model. The green are really dots, they only look like smudges. Each one of those is a student. And so we actually assign a real-world coordinate to all 12,500 students so that we can put them in a mapping system like this and also then overlay it on other kinds of data, census data, development data. And by doing that, we can relate the characteristics of the students directly to the characteristics of the neighborhoods. This neighborhood produces these students. This neighborhood produces those students. Moving forward on, and I'm really trying to kind of make this as quickly as possible, but housing construction, we've had about 1,200 new units come online since the 2000 census. That blip in the last year is the first part of the loft project that's going on downtown. A lot of multifamily units. But you can see we're still holding about, in 2008, 2009, 75 units or so, single family. That's more than they built in Lee Summit last year. So you talk about stability and strength of your local market. There is a strength here. There's a definite strength here. I mean, yes, it's down, but you should see the rest of the country. So that's a good takeaway. The other half of that takeaway is we added 1,200 units. I don't have this chart in this presentation because it's too detailed, but since that period of time, the number of vacant units in the city, the number of units that don't have anybody living in them, went up by 1,400. So we added 1,200 housing units over a period of 9 years, and we have 200 less households than we had before. So the construction that you see isn't adding population. It's just shifting it around inside the district. We know looking forward then in terms of the vacant land, and this is blocked out, but there's about, in the projects that I'm tracking, there's potential for about 2,100 more units to be built. And so at the rate we're going, we've got 15 or so years worth of supply basically already in the pipeline. So when I'm doing growth projections, I'm not constraining it in any way. There is land out there. If there wants to be growth, growth will happen. Where that growth is, and this actually map serves two purposes. The green dots on this map are the building permits that have been issued since 2000. So we XY coordinate all of those too. And although it's clustered in the northeast and the southeast, there's actually been a fair number of units reconstructed inside the city. So it's not all just about new development. It's really also about redevelopment and regeneration, which could be important as we go down the road. The polygons, which are a little harder to see, are the actual development projects, and those would house those 2,100 potential units. Again, the distribution is heavily weighted up here, although I think the future on down the road is actually down in the southeast. So what we do is we turn my projections of how many units are going to be built, along with how many So then that gives me a total number of housing units. How many of those are going to be occupied? Well, as of right now, only 88% of them are occupied. So there's 12% vacancy. That's almost double the 2000 census number. And the difference between the number of units and the number of households is how many are vacant. About 4,200. Population per household has been stable. It probably will continue to be. Taking that household, that's my key ingredient. How many housing units actually have somebody living in them? That's a household. That's my driver. I compare that to the school-age population. That's persons aged 5 to 17. Not that they go to your schools, it's just everybody aged 5 to 17 corresponds to grades K to 12. And so as of right now, there's 12,000, or this year, there's 12,880 of those persons. Down, 1,400 from 1990, down 1,200 since 2000. And then you look at the actual enrollment numbers in each of those years, you get a different rate, and then the comparison of the two is your capture. Because we know that when we're planning enrollment and we're doing population projections, I know that all those persons aren't going to come to your schools. 10% roughly of the school-age population attends a private or a public school or some other provider. So that's it's an important factor, and it's not an unusually high rate, it's very average. If I translate that into enrollment by grade, enrollment by cohort, so we're seeing next year, we're hoping for a little bit of a bounce back, but essentially we're still way down even where we were, in 2000. 300 or so students. With what I'm seeing in front of me, with the economic development potential and the development potential, I am seeing a bounce back of maybe 1,000 students over the next 15 years. And that's not a whole lot. That's like 0.6% per year. But it's better than going the other direction. And I don't see any dive, and I don't see any spikes. In addition to, like I said, the district numbers, we also look at, inside the district. And so now our green dots, which are all the current students, are joined by red dots. And the red dots are where I think we're actually going to pick up new students, in this case in the first 5-year period, from 09-10 to 14-15. And I do that on and out into the future. And ultimately what we end up with then is projections not just for the district, but for each one of the attendance areas. Attendance areas are different than campuses because this is where people live, not exactly where they go to school. And there's a difference because of programs and such, so don't dwell on any one number because it won't be the same as what you're used to seeing in other contexts. The last two columns you can dwell on. Last two columns tell us for each of the attendance areas for the elementary, middle, and high schools, what are we expecting in terms of this change in the number of students in the first 5-year period and the second 5-year period? And you can see your growth basically, clustered in Coleman and Skaith. Is that how you spell that? Okay. So that's a boiled down version of what we do in these projections, but it's trying to get the total right, but it's also trying to get the distribution right. And I have all the projections for all 317 so that we can aggregate them up into different groups and see how different school alternatives work. Now, I guess the bottom line of all of this is that basically enrollment is stable. It might increase slightly in the future, but we're not looking for any major shocks on either side. Student population is clearly shifting from the central area to the northeast, probably later to the southeast. And I expect that would continue. But we do have now, especially with this study and the one 2 years ago and the comparison and so forth, I think we really now have a really solid base of planning, at least projections that we can go forward with some confidence in being able to do the best we can for the students with the dollars that are available. So that was the long and the short of it, and I appreciate your attention very much.
Back to revenue, where our revenue comes from. The next largest slice of that pie is local property taxes, which are about 32%. We have two kinds of levies, the operating levy and the debt service levy, and you can see those numbers on the screen. That does include the 63 cents that will be reinstated in our 2010 levy. The operating levy is used for operations to open the doors, salaries, benefits, maintenance, and we'll talk about those.